Hello everybody, welcome back to The Gentleman Psychic. Make certain to hit the like and subscribe button, ring that notification bell to be updated on videos like this and many others. I don't know where my... Ring that bell. Speaking of ringing bells, there are bells ringing because it is that time of season. According to tradition, to legend, the ringing of bells drove away evil spirits. Now, it is, of course, a Christian tradition, but it goes back even further to more pagan roots of driving away the darkness with the sound of something melodic. So we are going to continue reading A Christmas Carol, or as I lovingly like to call it, an Xmas Carol. Yes, I know. I know. Many of you might be saying, but Xmas does mean Christmas. And that is true. X in Latin does mean Christ. However, I love to sort of troll those that go, oh, Xmas, they're taking Christ out of Christmas. So I actually do prefer Xmas, and I celebrate Xmas and Saturnalia and Krampusnacht. Oh, I love Krampusnacht. We missed it. It was just the other day on the 6th, but I love Krampus. How are you, my darlings? That's great. Good to hear it. There's nobody who answered that, but I really do.
Sophia answered you.
Oh, well, no, she would not from that. She didn't have a chance to. See, now Michael says he's so excited. Haha, how brilliant. So yes, we get to the point where we get to talk a little bit about Ebenezer Scrooge and his spirits. Oh, you know what? I think I know why. Oh, maybe that's why. I don't know. My phone has this weird line across there. I don't know if it's because, no, that's really weird. I don't know what that is. Do you see that line on your computer?
I don't see a line.
Okay, well, my phone has a weird line. I don't know if it's... I don't know. I see a weird white line right here.
There's not a line on the bridge there.
But it does have a line on the footage?
It does not.
It does not, okay. Well, I see a weird white line. I don't know why it's on my phone, but I have my faux flame going right here. It's not a real fire. Do you like my fire? Feels nice and warm, doesn't it? Nice and warm. So we left Ebenezer Scrooge with the visit of his long-dead business partner, Jacob Marley. Now, the spirit of Jacob Marley had entered into the apartments where Scrooge had lived. And Scrooge said, "There's more gravy than grave about you," in an attempt to sort of stave away his darkest suspicions. Okay. Stave 2. The first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12. It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct his most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. "Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and it is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything. He could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of his first exchange paid to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his order, and so forth, would have become mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought and thought and thought and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released, to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in his state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously, and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong! 1/4 said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong! 1/2 said Scrooge. Ding dong! 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong! The hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Bong! Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand, not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into half a recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am now to you. And I am standing in a spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin, and the arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were the uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was, that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality, for its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now with a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline could be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again distinct and clear as ever. Are you the spirit, sir, whose come was foretold to me? Asked Scrooge. I am. The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if, instead of being so close beside him, it were a great distance. Who and what are you? Demanded Scrooge. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. What? Exclaimed the ghost. Would you so soon put out the world with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and force me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow? Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him here. Your welfare, said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, Your reclamation, then, take heed. It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes. That bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robes in supplication. I'm a mortal, Scrooge remonstrated, and liable to fall. Bear but touch my hand there, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon the open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was clear, cold, winter day, with snow upon the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together, as he looked about him. I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lip, it's trembling, said the ghost. And what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him to where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit. Remember it, cried Scrooge with fervour. I could walk it blindfolded. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let us go on. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies were now seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why, he was rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them. Why did his cold eye glisten, and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted the crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was merry to Scrooge, out upon Merry Christmas? What good had it ever done to him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is still there." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock, surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes. For the spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach-houses and the sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall, and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold and vast. There was an earthly savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and went to see his poor forgotten self as it used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and a scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed water spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one of the despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence, and gave freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm, and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading an ass laden with wood by the bridle. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, I know. Oh, one Christmas time when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come, for the first time, just like that poor boy." "And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson. Oh, poor boy." "And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, asleep, at the gate of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There is upon his head, it serves him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to a princess?" To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face would have been surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. "There's the parrot," cried Scrooge, "green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out of its top of its head. There he is, poor Robin Crusoe, he called him when he came home again after sailing round the island. Poor Robin Crusoe. Where have you been, Robin Crusoe?" The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to Little Creek. Oh, hallo, hoop, hallo! Then, with rapidity of transition, very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hands in his pocket and looking about him, after drying his eyes with his cuff. "But, it's too late now, about him. After drying his, it's too late now about him." "What's the matter?" asked the spirit. Nothing, said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying, as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, with all other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and put her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home, for good and all. Home, forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night, when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should. And he sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world." "You're quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being so little, laughed again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace him, when she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there." And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind, shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of shivering best parlour that was seen, where the maps upon the wall, and the celestial and the terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. But he produced a decanter of curiously light wine, and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he'd rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied on the top of the chaise. The children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Always a delicate creature, from a breath might have withered, said the ghost. But she had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit, God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost, your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, yes. Although they had but that moment left in the school behind them, they were now in busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and prepassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. Was I apprenticed here? They went in at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, why, it's old Fezziwig. Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo ho ho! There, Ebenezer, Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me. Yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick, poor Dick, dear, dear, dear. Yo ho, my boy, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick, Christmas Eve, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those 2 fellows went at it. They charged into the street with shutters 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their places, 4, 5, 6, barred 'em, pinned 'em, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. Hilly-hoo! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let us have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheery up, Ebenezer! Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, and the lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and bright a ballroom as you could desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with music book, and went up to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having bored enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling, In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round and back again, the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping, old top couple always turning up in wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last. And why is it not? He has spent but a few pounds. I feel like I've missed a page. I did. All top couples, and at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But, scorning the rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home, exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and the boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it him, struck up Sir Roger de Crovelly. Then old Fezziwig stood out to the dance floor with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners. People were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. It's that, if that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would become of 'em next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back of the shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and his soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon his head burned very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated, by the remark and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks and things so slight and insignificant that is impossible to add and count him up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. He felt the spirit's glance had stopped. "What's the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His former self turned down the lamps as he gave the utterance to the wish. And Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick." This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in his eyes, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly, "to you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one." "This is the even-hand dealings of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Am I?" "Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, and tell in good reason. We could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man." "I was a boy," he said impatiently. "Your own feeling tells you that you were not what you are," she returned. "I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in the heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought release?" "In words, no, never." "In what then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end. In everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us," said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, "tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now?" "No, you wouldn't." He seemed to yield to the justice of his supposition, in spite of himself. "I would gladly think otherwise if I could," she answered. Oh, that was her. "I would gladly think otherwise if I could," she answered. "Heaven knows, when I have learned the truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, who you, in your very confidence with her, weigh everything with gain, or choosing her for a moment, you were false enough to your one guiding principle, to do so? I not know. Do I not know what that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him you once were. He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed, You may. The memory of what is past half makes me hope you will have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly, as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight in my torture? One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. No, no more, no more, cried Scrooge. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more. But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. There they were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the lost Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge, in his agitated state of mind, could count. And, unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, there were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care to the contrary. The mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter soon became to mingle in the sports got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What would I not have given to be one of them, though I never could have been so rude? So no, I wouldn't for the wealth of all the world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down. For the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked it off. God bless my soul, to save my life. As measuring her waist in sport as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown around it for the punishment and never come straight again, and yet I should have dearly liked it, should have dearly liked. I own to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves of hair, an inch of which would be a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet been man enough to know its value. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she was with the laughing face and plundered dress was borne towards it, the center of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made of the defenseless porter, the scaling him with chairs for ladders to dive into his pockets, despoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him round the neck, pummel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received, the terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into its mouth, and was more than suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. the immense relief of finding this false alarm, the joy and the gratitude and the ecstasy, they're all indescribable alike. It's enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlour, and, by one stair at a time, up at the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided, and now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever. When the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature quite as graceful and as full of promise might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon. Who was it? Guess." "How can I? Tut, don't I know?" she added, in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. "Mr. Scrooge." "Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death. I hear there he sat alone, quite alone, in the world, I do believe." "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are. Do not blame me." Remove me, Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and, seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer." In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright and dimly connecting that with its influence over him. He seized the extinguisher cap, and by sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and farther of being in his own bedroom, he gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and barely time to reel it to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. That was at 47. Would you like to go on a little bit longer? Or should we save that for next week? I shall let you decide, my darlings. D. Lucero says, yes, more. Then here we go. We shall continue. Stave 3. The second of the three spirits. Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the especial purpose of holding a conference with a second messenger, dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But, finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains his new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and laying down again, established a sharp lookout all around the bed, for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as hardly as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre ablaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts. As he was powerless to make out what it meant or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion. Without having the consolation of knowing, at last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it's always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of his ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of it which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. And such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney. The dull petrification of the chimney had not known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, for many and many a winter season had gone, heaped up upon the floor, to form the kind of throne where turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon the couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in the shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost, "come in, and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though its eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet with them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple, deep green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. His garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining it to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set there and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free. free as its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cherry voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust.
"You have never seen a ghost like me!" exclaimed the spirit.
"Never," Scrooge made answer to it.
"Have never walked forth with younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers, born in these years?" pursued the phantom.
I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?"
"More than 1,800.
said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now, tonight. If you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it."
"Touch my robe."
Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from tops of the houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with smooth white sheet of snow upon the ground, which, last deposited, had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy heels and carts and wagons. Furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with dingy must, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate of the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that clearest summer air and the brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain? For the people who were shoveling away on their housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out in the streets of their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in the blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk, biffins, squab, and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among the choice fruits in a bowl. Though members of the dull and stagnant-blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and, to a fish, went gasping round and round their little world in slow, passionless excitement. The grocers, oh, the grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through those gaps, such glimpses, it was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and it's in Christmas dress. But the customers were all so hurried and so eager in their hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up again each other at the door, clashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humour possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection and for Christmas daws of peck to peck at if they chose. But soon the steeples called good people, all, to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and their gayest faces, and at the same time there emerged scores of by-streets, lanes, nameless, turning, innumerable people, carrying their dinners to their bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And their bearers, it was very uncommon kind of torch. For once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time, the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all of the dinners, and the progress of their cooking. It thawed blotch of wet above the baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if the stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge.
There is, my own.
Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day? Asked Scrooge.
To any kindly given, to a poor one most.
Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge.
Because it needs it the most.
Spirit, said Scrooge, after a moment's thought. I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment.
Aye, cried the spirit.
You would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge, wouldn't you? Aye, cried the spirit. You seek to close these places on the 7th day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek, exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. You remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite gracefully, and like a supernatural creature, as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the good spirit had in showing off his power of this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks, for there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays and 15 copies of Christian Name, and yet the ghost of Christmas Present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6 pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt-collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honour of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onions, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. What has it ever got to your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha wasn't as late as Christmas Day by half an hour. Here's Martha, mother, said a girl, appearing as she spoke. Here's Martha, mother, cried the 2 young Cratchits. Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are, said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her, with officious zeal. We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl, and had no clear way this morning, mother. Well, never you mind, said as long as you come, said Mrs. Cratchit. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye. Oh, no, there's father coming, cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide. So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his little limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob, with a sudden declination in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from the church, and had come home rampant. Not coming on Christmas Day. Martha didn't like to see him disappointed. if it were only in joke. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tiny Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember that on Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them, and he trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits sat chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose around the table with the handle of the knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone on the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in a sage and onion and to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall over the backyard and stolen it while they were all merry with the goose, supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hullo! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a miniature, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of the quatrain of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for so large a family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, and the hearth swept, and the fire made up, the compound of the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and shovelful of chestnuts on the fire, and all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dear hearts. God bless us," which the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, and if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, he dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before. Tell me, Spirit, will Tiny Tim live?" "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." No, said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind Spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. When, then, if he be like to die, he better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of our feast." "Founder of our feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here, I do. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "Should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink to his health for your sake." "And for today's," said Mrs. Cratchit. Not for his long life to him. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast dark shadows on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 minutes merrier than before from the mere relief of Scrooge. The baleful being done with, Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into his receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at the milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at the stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, a countess and lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time, the chestnuts and the jug went round and round, and by the by, they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of pawnbrokers, but they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchen parlours, and all sorts of rooms, was wonderful. Here, with the flickering of a blaze, showed the preparations of a cosy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window, blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches. Well, they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged them from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might well have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company, and piling up its fires half chimney high, blessings on it, how the ghost exalted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter, who ran on before, dotting the dusky streets with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed. Though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor. Their monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about as though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkness night. "What is this place?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. But they know me, see? A light shone from the windows of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing with them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they had all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigour sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither, not to see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth, built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through. There stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds. Borne the wind, one might suppose the seaweed of the water rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other a Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder, too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again, the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on and on until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside a helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, the dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, walking or sleeping, good or bad, had kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and the thinking of the solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over the unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha ha!" laughed Scrooge. Laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is in infection, in disease, and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor." When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and they assembled friends being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily. he said. He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in a little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking. You know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least he always tells me. At least you always tell me so. What of it, my dear, said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't made himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself. Always. Here he was into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner, and indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and, with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast, who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one, with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us, and not making merry with us, is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good-natured, and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment, and passed the bottle joyously. Another tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family, and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or a catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in a bass like a good one, and never swell in large veins in his forehead, or get red in the face over it, Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind, and softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for its own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it's a good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop, there was a first game at Blind Man's Bluff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had his eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after Plump Sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself amongst the curtains. Wherever she went, there he went. He always knew where the Plump Sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, and stood there, he would have made a feint endeavouring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the Plump Sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when, at last, he caught her, when, in spite of all of her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable, for his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it. When another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's bluff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too. As Topper could have told you, there might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for, wholly forgetting in the interest in what was going on, that his voice, pardon me, for his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed right, too, for the sharpest needle. Best Whitechapel, warranted not to cut in eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But the spirit could not be done. Said it could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. One half hour. Spirit only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something. The rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no. As the case was, the brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from them that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, his nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to give off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I've got it! I've found it! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had never had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, to Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. "A Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless, Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in their inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him the time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they say, and far they went, much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close to home, by struggling men, and they were patient, in the greater hope, by poverty, and it was rich, in almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holiday appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party. Then, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that his hair was grey. Are spirits' lives short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight? At midnight? Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:75 at that moment. "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is that a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, and a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked, and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no preservation of humanity in any grade through all of the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled, having them shown to him in this way. He tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, spirit. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them. And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them, and all of their degree, but most of all beware of this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom. And unless the writing be erased, deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye, admit it for your factitious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end. They have no refuge or resources, cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time, and in his own words, are there no workhouses? Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting his eyes beheld solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming along like a mist along the ground towards him. And I believe, my darlings, that is where we shall end for the evening. We shall resume with the ghost of Christmas future next Tuesday at the same time. I do hope you are enjoying. If you are, I love you. If you don't, great. If you can support this channel, a great way of doing so is through the Patreon under the Gentleman's House. You can also find me on PayPal under rlillard6@gmail.com. You can find me on Venmo at Richard-Lael Lillard. And if you can't, you don't. If you can and it brings you joy, I appreciate you. I really appreciate you this holiday season. Thank you everybody for joining me. Thank you for all the likes, the comments, and the shares. And I do hope you do share these. It does help me out tremendously. Thank you, my lovelies. I think I'll wait until the things pop up here a little bit more. Did you enter everything you needed?
I've not. I'll be there just a second, sorry.
That's quite all right. We'll give it a couple more seconds, my lovelies, and then I shall bid you good night, my lovelies.
There we go. There's your Patreon link.
Patreon link is here, the Gentleman's House. And then coming up is Venmo and PayPal. Good night, Dee. Good night, my friends. Good night, my beauties. Good night, Malika. I was not able to see everyone in here because I had my nose in a book. But I ever so appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for being in my world, in my life. I appreciate you. Is that everything?
Yeah, I think so.
Good night, my lovelies. Good night.